Hey guys, it's Nick, and welcome back to episode 5 of Whiteboard Wednesday. Sorry for the long delay between videos, but thanks for coming back, and today's going to be a fun one because today we start talking about how you make money in real estate, beginning with cash flow. So the last several weeks, I've walked you through a property that Holly and I looked at and we're considering putting in an offer on. First week, we talked about how to determine how much income that property can generate. Then we looked at all of the expenses associated with owning that property. Then we looked at how much we have to set aside in reserves for maintenance, capital expenditures, and vacancy. And finally, what you're left with is cash flow. So when you take all the rental money coming in, subtract your expenses, subtract what you're setting aside with reserves, what's left is cash flow. So what do you do with your cash flow? It's kind of like dividends in stocks. You can do whatever you want with it. Some people will reinvest it into future real estate. Some people will use it to build up their reserve account so they have a nice cushion. Some people will use it to pay down the mortgage. Or you can use it to pay your own bills, to go on vacation, to buy a pumpkin spice latte, right? That's your money. It's your money that's left over at the end of the month, and it's up to you to do what you want with it. Before we move into kind of how much cash flow you should be looking for, there's 3 things that I want to point out about cash flow. So number 1, cash flow is the output of this equation. This equation is the underwriting process. That's what we've been talking about the last few weeks. So what you're doing is you're underwriting this property, you're determining how much cash flow it could generate. So in any equation like this, the output is only as good as the inputs that you put into it. So if you underestimate or if you overestimate, let's say, how much rent you can get, underestimate your property taxes, right? You may think that you can get $270 of cash flow, but in reality, it might be $100 because your numbers here weren't correct. So if you didn't watch each of these videos where we talk about some tips on how to get these numbers as accurate as possible, I recommend you go back and watch those. Because garbage in, garbage out. So you need to get really good information to determine these numbers so you have a good sense of what your cash flow will be. Point 2 about cash flow, I recommend doing this equation, especially when you're new, at least 3 times for every property. So if you're looking at putting in an offer on a property, do it like this, which is as close as possible to what you think the actual cash flow will be. Then run a really conservative scenario. Hey, I couldn't get the rents that I thought I was going to get. My insurance ended up being higher than all of my other properties. What would your cash flow be in that scenario? And then run an aggressive scenario. The market gets hot. I got more rent than I thought. The property taxes and insurance ended up being lower than I expected. So maybe your aggressive scenario, you see, I could have up to $400 of cash flow, but the conservative scenario, it's only $110. Well, then your range, depending on if things go really well or really poorly, is somewhere between $100 and $400-ish of cash flow, and 270 is kind of in the middle where you're predicting. And then what I would recommend that you do is keep those numbers over time. If you're putting in an offer on a property, especially if you buy it, keep your underwriting numbers for each scenario. And then over time, after the first year, see how close you were. See, I predicted 270 and it was 300. I was pretty close. What did you guess well? What did you, guess might be the wrong word, but what did you project well? What did you not correctly project? So I can tell you that our numbers are almost always higher than our baseline scenario. Because we tend to underwrite even our baseline scenario conservatively. So all of our properties have cash flowed more than our estimates when we have done our underwriting. The third point that I want to make about cash flow overall is that what you're predicting is your first year cash flow. But keep in mind that cash flow tends to go up every year. So rent growth, rents go up over time. But if you have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, your mortgage stays the same. So while your insurance and your taxes might go up a little bit, your rent is going to go up enough to make this continue to be higher than your expenses year over year, and that gap is going to grow. And your reserves are typically a percentage of your income, so that's going to stay fixed. As your income goes up, you're going to be putting more into your reserves, but overall, that's kind of a wash. So cash flow goes up over time. So if you look at a property year 1, especially right now when interest rates are high and prices are still pretty high, it's hard to find something that has good cash flow numbers, but project that into the future. If rents keep going up, your cash flow will go up over time. So don't use that as an excuse to buy a bad deal, but just know that your year 1 cash flow is probably the lowest your cash flow will ever be. So now we're going to start talking about how much cash flow do you need? And in order to answer that question, you have to recognize that cash flow and appreciation, put them kind of on a scale here. It's a spectrum. So when you have a property that appreciates a ton, those properties tend to be more expensive. Think about a market like San Diego. Great weather, right by the beach, but limited supply of houses. So that becomes more and more popular over time. The prices go up. Those properties aren't going to cash flow particularly well because the price to rent ratio isn't great. The houses are so expensive, and although the rents are high, they're not high enough to offset how expensive those mortgage payments are going to be. But buying a property in San Diego, those tend to go up a ton over time. Whereas other properties might be very cash flow intensive. Maybe you can buy, a property for much cheaper in a different market. The price to rent ratio is much better. You're getting a lot more cash flow, but that property may not appreciate as much over time. So some properties may have less cash flow, but might appreciate a ton. And some properties might have a ton of cash flow, but might not ever go up too much in value. So it's important to know what kind of property you're in. It can be based on the market, the property type, the neighborhood, and also what do you need? So if you are looking to quit your job and you're looking for your real estate to replace your income, you need cash flow. You need money coming in every month to pay your bills. But if you love your job and you're planning on working till retirement, and this is your long-term retirement plan, you don't need cash flow now. So you can buy a property that appreciates more, and you don't really need to worry about living off the cash flow. And you can, when you retire, have a ton of money there that is your retirement savings. So it's really, you need to know your goals. You need to know what you want. Holly and I personally, we look for hybrids. So we look for properties that are in areas that will both appreciate, but have some cash flow as well. We know that we're not getting the maximal amount of either, but we know we're going to fall somewhere in the middle on both. So what are we personally looking for? On a single family home, we want a minimum of $200 a month in cash flow. Now, we certainly would like more than that, and all of our single family homes have started out cash flowing more like $400 or $500 a month, but 200 is like the minimum baseline to even, consider before we would put in an offer. There's some economies of scale as you add units. So for 2 to 4 units, we want a minimum of $150 per door. So that would be $300 for a duplex, $600 for a quadplex. And for five or more units, we're looking for a minimum of $100 of cash flow per door. So an 8 unit, a minimum of $800. And again, our 8 unit right now, we're doing more like $300 to $400 a month on our long-term rentals, and our midterm rentals are even higher than that. So again, these are kind of our baseline, but it's important to recognize that these numbers can change significantly based on if you're in an appreciation or cash flow market, what type of properties you're looking at. The other thing that's really important to note is that these numbers vary a ton based on how much money you invest. So $200, might be a great cash flow if you only invested $20,000. But if you invested $200,000, that's not a great cash flow because you're getting less return on your investment. So next week, we'll talk about how to take these numbers and kind of weigh them between different properties. A cheaper property that cash flows $200 might actually be better than a more expensive property that cash flows $400. So we'll talk about how to compare these using cash on cash return on investment. So make sure you join us next week on Whiteboard Wednesday. Thanks for joining us and have a great week.